So, agree, disagree scales in online surveys, left, right, top and middle thoughts. Moving in to those now smoothly. And I'm going to be concentrating on the agree-disagree scale. There's lots of varieties of agree-disagree scale. It's often described as being a Likert scale. Strictly speaking, it's more like a Likert item. A Likert scale is a combination of Likert items. We ask it in formats like this. We would say agree strongly, agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, disagree strongly. There are lots of varieties. Some people will have 7 points in that scale. Some people use phrases like somewhat agree. But the general look and feel has been around now for about 80 years, dating all the way back to the great era of psychometricians and Likert himself, working with people like Thurston to come up with the scales that really stood the test of time and have been used in our industry for a long time. Now, I'm going to look at 4 issues or 4 potential problems, things that people have queried about the agree-disagree scale. The first is acquiescence bias. Then I'm going to look at the issue of left versus right, and then top versus bottom. And finally, just a few thoughts on midpoints and what does that really strange phrase, neither agree nor disagree, mean, and what does it do on the scales. So first of all, acquiescence bias. And this is quite a problem. The speaker who's probably best known for talking about it is John Krosnick. This paper by Saris, Krosnick and Schaefer is a really good introduction to the issues around acquiescence bias. They have looked at hundreds of studies and have come to the conclusion that too many people agree. So if we ask people, do you agree that this is a great bottle, then you get too many people agreeing, and we say, now do you agree that this is a great bottle? And again, we get slightly too many. There's a percentage of people who will click agree. It's an acquiescence bias. It's there over and over again in the data. This is why people will very often say, let's use a bipolar scale, let's use a 7-point rating scale or a 10-point rating scale, as opposed to agree, disagree. But a lot of the time, we are going to use agree, disagree, either because it fits the research needs, or we're going to use it simply because it is going to help establish the credibility. This is particularly true in a lot of public opinion work, where you really don't want to be focusing time discussing the methodology, you want to be talking about the results. So what can we do with our agree, disagree scale? The traditional solution in academic research and social research was we would include each factor several times with slightly different wording. So if we wanted to know how much you thought something was happy, you would ask some strongly worded questions and some weak worded questions to get a better breadth of scale. And we would phrase half of those positive and half negative. So we may have 8 scales relating to what we think is the factor happiness. 4 of those would be worded positively, 4 would be worded negatively. When we come to process them, we would flip the half that is negative around. And so we feel that we've probably dealt with the acquiescence bias then. But in modern market research, it's not practical for 2 reasons. The first is that we actually try very hard to ask 1 scale per factor. We do a lot of work, we run factor analyses and shade and cart. We try to minimize the correlation between the attributes, because that way we minimize the number of questions that we ask the respondents. We've got 20 things we want to understand. We want to ask 20 questions. We don't want to ask 8 times 20 questions to be able to have that sort of balanced approach to each one. We also almost only ask positive questions. That's because we want to produce actionable findings. So if, for example, we had the scale not fashionable, and we found out that people didn't agree with it, we would go back to the client and say, it's important that people do not think that you're not fashionable. And to which the client can say, but what should we be? We want positive findings. So in market research, we typically use 1 scale per factor, and we typically word it in a positive way so that we get actionable findings. So we're going to have to live with that agreement bias as being part of what's going on, the acquiescence bias in the data. Then we get to item order response bias, and there's a lot of good names in this field, as you can see. But this, again, is a really important factor. Many sources out there, you can Google people like Krosnick, Chan, Friedman, who have done a lot of research in this area, and it appears that the things that are presented first are more likely to be picked. So things that use the word agree are more likely to be picked. Things that are presented first are more likely to be picked. What do I mean by that? Well, here's a very simple 3-point scale. And scale A has got agree on the left, and scale B has got disagree on the left. And what the data has suggested in their studies is that in A, more people will agree, and in B, more people will disagree because it's the first item in the list. Now, a lot of this research has been conducted in places like universities with students. A lot of this research is in North America. So I thought it would be useful just to validate that and have a look in terms of the sample that I use on a regular basis with some of the context that I often do a lot of my research in. So I had the opportunity to run several cells of research in the UK on our online access panel, the Springboard panel. So each cell has got about 500 people in. That's because each wave has 2,000 people, and we just randomly assign people to the 4 groups and match them, which enabled me to do some experimentation in the UK on the sorts of people that I research. And pretty straightforward question: to what extent do you agree or disagree with the statement Diet Coke, orange juice, milk and red wine are healthy drinks? And much to the disappointment of my colleagues, I used a very boring layout scale because on this particular study I wanted to concentrate on the wording, not on the impact of different forms of engagement. So A is the option where we have agree strongly on the left, and we've got a very classic layout there, and we've got nasty radio buttons and grids. And B, we've got disagree strongly on the left. And the hypothesis that has come from all the literature is that in A, we should see more people agreeing, and in B, we should see more people disagreeing. So let's have a look and see what we did get. First of all, just to look at the Diet Coke. How many people agree strongly that it's healthy? And very few people, not surprisingly, agree that it's very healthy, but more people agreed strongly when we put agree strongly on the left of the scale, 5% down to 2%, which is statistically significant within this cell. Very little difference in the agree, neither nor, and the disagree. But if we put disagree strongly on the left, which is the red bar, we get more people disagreeing strongly. So we get exactly the effect that we expected to get. Not very strong, which is also an important part of the message. Now, rather than going through all the charts, we're just going to summarize them. So we had 4 products that we were testing. Putting agree on the left produced 5% instead of 2% agreeing with Diet Coke healthy, 21% versus 16% for orange juice, and for milk, 38% versus 30%. So we clearly got more agreement, more agree strongly in particular, when we put the agree on the left. Looking now at the disagree part of the picture, what percentage disagreed strongly? If we put disagree strongly on the left, for Diet Coke, we get 31% disagreeing strongly instead of 27%. For red wine, we get 9% disagreeing strongly instead of 5%. So, in context, so this is people in the UK answering panel surveys about this sort of product. So I don't want to generalize too widely, but it is entirely consistent with everybody else's findings. Real but not big. I think that's an important message. This is a bit of a complex layout here, so I'll just go down from the top of the page. If milk A is when we asked with agree on the left, milk B is when we asked with agree on the right. So although it changes the answers, it doesn't make milk less healthy than orange. And asking orange juice A on the left and B is where disagree was on the left, that change changed the answers from 76% to 72%, but it didn't change the order. On the right-hand side is a horrible thing which I really don't recommend that people do, which is I treated disagree strongly as 1, disagree as 2, neither nor as 3, agree as 4, and agree strongly as 5, and calculated means. It's a terrible thing to do with agree-disagree data, by the way, because it really just flattens out the data. But again, we can see that irrespective of which way round we ask the question, milk is healthier than orange juice, is healthier than red wine, is healthier than Diet Coke. So what that really tells us, in terms of the observations, is that acquiescence bias leads to higher agreement. Putting agree on the left increases that bias. So by using an agree scale, we've got a bias towards acquiescence. If we put agree on the left-hand side of the scale, we are going to increase the amount of bias towards agreement. If we put agree on the right, we're going to reduce the bias. Probably not by enough, but we are at least moving back in the right direction. However, the effect is not very large. If you have a client who really wants to put agree on the left, it's not the end of the world. Your numbers in absolute terms are going to be slightly different, but the only really important message is don't mix and match. Don't have for some respondents on the left and for some respondents on the right, because if you then try to segment your data, you'll find you'll be segmenting them not on personality characteristics, but on the way the survey was conducted. Don't have some of your questions with agree on the left and some with agree on the right, because that is going to obscure your findings. Make a decision and live with it. The best option is to put agree on the right, but you can live with agree on the left. It's not going to make a massive difference. But don't mix and match. Okay, now we're moving to something slightly more entertaining now, top to bottom. And I'll let my colleagues this time come up with a slightly more interesting question. To what extent do you agree or disagree with the statement, water, white wine, apple juice and Coke are healthy drinks? And this time each of them comes up as a little card on the left, and you drag it across and drop it on one of the boxes on the right. So we have agree on the top and disagree on the bottom. What's interesting about this is that many clients I speak to, many researchers I speak to, like to lay out the scale this way. They think it just makes more common sense. And they don't particularly like to lay it out this way, with disagree strongly at the top and agree strongly at the bottom. They just think it's kind of counterintuitive to be dragging the thing you like all the way to the bottom. So what do the data suggest is going on here? So first of all, we're going to look at water. And again, the blue data A is where water is at the top, and the red data, water B, is where water was at the bottom, where agree strongly was at the bottom and disagree strongly was at the top. And again, we see the same sort of effect, and in fact for water very strongly. If agree strongly is the top box, it got 83% agree strongly. If disagree strongly was the top box and agree strongly was at the bottom of the page, only 66% of people agreed strongly. So we've got a big difference between the two. Where did that difference come from? It mostly came from the agrees being stronger. So if we have disagree strongly at the top, we have more agrees and fewer agree strongly. If we have agree strongly at the top of the page, we have more agree stronglys and fewer agrees. Very few people are disagreeing that water is healthy, which is pretty sensible, really. Okay, so to summarize that, we see strong impact for water. We see a strong impact on the apple juice question. So agree strongly at the top generated 19% agree stronglys. Putting agree strongly at the bottom only generated 13%. So few people think that white wine and Coke are healthy, then it doesn't make much difference to the numbers. However, looking at the disagrees, then we see the data for white wine and Coke coming through. So if we put disagree at the bottom and agree at the top, only 5% think that white wine is disagree strongly with the proposition it's healthy. If we put disagree at the top, that jumps to 11%. Similarly, if we have disagree at the top of the scale, 46% of people think that Coke would disagree strongly that Coke is healthy. So we have a very clear difference, and in fact the differences appear to be bigger for the top to bottom than they do to be the left-right scale. Now we've got a lot of things going on here. We've got slightly different products. We have got a visual question, so we've got a lot more activity going on. We've got drag and drop as opposed to just clicking radio buttons. So we can't generalize too far, but it does support all the stuff that's in the academic literature, that whatever you ask first is likely to be picked first. And so we're compounding the bias. Don't mix and match is the very strong message there. We can see that you really wouldn't want to mix horizontal questions with vertical questions. You really wouldn't want to have some agree on the left and some agree on the right and some agree on the top and some would agree on the bottom. So response order thoughts before moving on to the midpoint. There definitely are order effects. Other people have shown them. Everything that's coming out of things like behavioral economics and cognitive psychology tell us that there are order effects. Putting agree on the left top compounds the acquiescence bias. It makes things slightly worse. All other things being equal, I would strongly suggest putting disagree on the left of a left-right scale and on the top of a top-down scale. But don't mix and match. That's a much stronger message. If you have a client that wants to put agree strongly at the top of the page, that's fine, but do it consistently. So, final topic is about midpoints. There's a lot of discussion amongst people who attend conferences talking about things like scales about what does neither agree nor disagree mean. Should it really be used as a midpoint? People will say semantically it doesn't really belong there because we can see what agree means and we can see what disagree means. But really, what does neither agree nor disagree? There's the old joke that if you go to a party and you ask somebody how the party is and they say, oh, I'm neither enjoying nor not enjoying the party, well, they must be a market researcher because that construction doesn't exist in the real world. It's been constructed for surveys. So they could be a social researcher, an academic researcher as well, of course. So there is a lot of concern about whether that wording works, and people have tried different wordings and they've come up with different ideas. So again, I wanted to look at that. And so the first thing I looked at is it really collecting a lot of people who want to say don't know? So we simply added don't know to the scale, put it on the right-hand side. And what was interesting in this study with these attributes and these questions with this panel is that we got 0% of people saying that they didn't know whether water was healthy or not, 2% red wine, 0% milk, 0% coffee, 0% Diet Coke. Now, what's interesting about that is in a purely objective scientific sense, one might expect 10, 20, 30% of people not to know whether all of those are healthy. There's really quite a debate about red wine and how healthy it is. I would suspect if you ask doctors, you'd get a lot more disagreement. But actually, people doing surveys are used to taking a position. Most of them are prepared to say, yeah, I disagree or I agree strongly with the proposition that water is healthy or that red wine is healthy. And that's quite interesting. So we don't feel on this scale that neither agree nor disagree is acting as too much of a repository for don't know. So the next one, following a suggestion from one of my colleagues, is we move neither agree nor disagree to the end, because if semantics, if the definition of the word is doing all of the work, it shouldn't matter where we position the scale. So let's position it at the end. So we've got disagree, strongly, disagree, agree, agree strongly, and then neither agree nor disagree. And what impact does that have on the data? And I'm just going to run quickly through the different products because they have slightly different impacts. If we look at water, then on the blue line we've got neither agree nor disagree in the middle, and we would expect the midpoint of a scale to either lie between disagree or agree, or to have a nice shape in terms of disagree and agree if it's acting as a midpoint, because we want to know whether it's the midpoint of the data. And the blue line looks good, and then if we put it to the end, that looks good as well. So it makes very little difference. But that's probably because almost nobody disagrees or says neither agree nor disagree for water and healthy. Almost everybody agrees or agrees strongly that water is healthy. Now we get to quite an interesting one, red wine. So here is where neither agree nor disagree was asked in the middle. And we get a sort of very, very crude normal distribution as normal as you can get with only 5 points in the data. The midpoint looks like it's behaving in a very sensible way. Now let's move neither agree nor disagree to the end, and we get far fewer neither agrees nor disagrees. So what this is suggesting to me is that there is a semantic component to put in the neither agree nor disagree and a positional component. That 15% is the semantic component. If we move the scale to the end, we're getting some semantic reading, but we're losing the midpoint of people saying, well, it's kind of in between disagree and agree. And that's what we're getting with the blue point. We're getting this combination of the semantic meaning and a straightforward midpoint. They're taking it as the middle of the scale. They're not saying it is healthy or it's not. They're saying it's somewhere in between. It's one of those products that you simply put in between the healthy category and the unhealthy category. So let's have a look now at milk. Milk is generally speaking healthy, but it's quite interesting in that we have far fewer people agreeing strongly than agree. Now this is telling us that people are not answering the scale semantically, perhaps in the way that you might think it is, because you might think that really it means that I believe it more strongly, but it looks like people are saying how healthy they think milk is, not the extent to which they believe that it's healthy. Because we have this, yeah, it's healthy, but it's not very healthy, sort of drop-off. We put in the scale, the neither agree nor disagree at the end, and we see we've got fairly similar data, but again, we've lost some of that positional. The semantic sense works, but the positional midpoint drops, so we get slightly fewer neither agrees nor disagrees and more agree stronglys, which probably isn't a change we're altogether happy about. We might have been happy with agrees going up, but pushing people all the way to agree strongly seems a bit too far. Coffee, we have that very loosely sort of bell-shaped curve, not many people agreeing and agreeing strongly. We move the neither agree scale. We can see that the red point, about 15%, has still got the semantic component, but we've lost that positional midpoint, and now we have made more people agree that coffee is healthy. And that seems probably a little bit counterintuitive to me, and again suggests that we've lost that midpoint and we've simply pushed some people into disagreeing and agreeing who really don't want to. Final scale, Diet Coke. Not many people think it's healthy, not surprisingly, but again we see this difference between a positional sense for neither agree nor disagree and a semantic sense when we ask the scale at the end. So, what can we conclude about neither nor? In this sort of scale, used in market research, with people who do quite a few surveys, remembering people in online panels do quite a lot of surveys, where the ends are the opposite. So we've got healthy versus unhealthy. If we had Democrat versus Republican, or liberal versus conservative, or socialist versus centrist, then we would think that the middle may not actually lie in between the two opposites. But in the sort of scale we're talking about here, where we're implying healthy versus unhealthy, and we have agree strongly versus disagree strongly, it seems to work. And where people who do not agree with or disagree are likely to be in the middle, then using the 5-point agree-disagree scale works really well, even if it doesn't always make semantic sense. So what people are doing with the scale, and I think this is probably exactly why Likert developed the scale in the first place and why it's lasted 80 years, is not that it necessarily makes semantic sense, but it makes scaling sense. People know how to use it and they can use it. So concluding thoughts, the way we ask questions shapes the answers. That's kind of scary, really. We can't remove bias. We need to recognize it. We need to hold it constant. If we can match up a positive bias and a negative bias, we can reduce the net amount, but we're still not going to remove it. Most standard formats of questionnaires, the things you see on a regular basis, work reasonably well. But don't mix and match them within one study, and certainly don't mix and match them between subsequent waves. So thank you very much from me, and I look forward to any questions.